I started this month with The Transit of Venus by Shirley Hazzard. Hazzard was originally from Australia, although I think she ended up moving to the States at some point. And this is her, I think her third novel, which came out in 1980, and you can see it won the National Book Critics Circle Award for Fiction, which I think is pretty esteemed as far as these literary awards go. This book is about a group of characters. The sort of center of this group are these two sisters, Caroline and Grace, who are originally from Australia, and they lose their parents in a boating accident, like a ship sinks with their parents on it, and as they're orphaned, they sort of end up in foster care with a half sister, and they make their way over to Europe. We sort of get to learn about their lives as they unfold, sort of from the 1950s to the end of the 70s. It's about a 30-year period where we're living in this circle of characters. Of the two sisters, I think Caroline gets the bulk of the writing here, and we do get chapters that in which neither of them really appear or are the focus of the book. And in many ways, the main character of the book is the one who is introduced in the first chapter, and that's Ted Tice. Ted Tice is awesome. When I read, I really don't focus on characters I love. I'm not the sort of reader who finds a character as the strong point of attachment to a novel. But this year it's happened to me twice, and it's been a wonderful surprise both times. Last time was reading Lawrence Durrell, and I felt really attached to Perce Warden. And here, I love Ted Tice. I've finished this book just remembering how great of a character I thought Ted Tice was. He sort of enters the story at the beginning in this storm, and he's walking into this manor, the manor where he will eventually meet Caroline and Grace. Caroline in particular, who he falls in love with. The description of him arriving to this house is very stark, and he sort of brings this sort of bearing of ill tidings with him as he's approaching this manor. Of course, he sees Caroline, and sort of the clouds clear for him. Of course, the relationship is not so simple, and it really unfolds continually over time. And the sisters marry. They have various relationships. Grace has sort of a more traditional relationship, and Caroline sort of finds herself going in between various partners, and we get to see inside their partners' lives as well, their sort of psychological attitudes and approaches to life. We get lots of different kinds of people operating around this sort of one central group. And the thing tying everything together for these people, besides the sisters and their emigration, which I think at one point Hazzard refers to as it's going to Europe was about as final as going to heaven, a mystical passage to another life from which no one returned the same. So you have these people, these two sisters, who are in many ways entering an afterlife. On top of that, you have the figures who they meet, and specifically Ted Tice and the secrets he holds. He reveals one secret very early in the book to Caroline, where he's on the beach. This takes place, in the years following the Second World War. Ted Tice is studying to be a scientist, and he wants to, build a telescope and observe the stars. And this is where we get a lot of the title, The Transit of Venus, these sort of rare occurrences that we can observe in our lifetimes. He wants to be a scientist, and he's on the beach, and he comes across a man who he recognizes as a German scientist and a German war criminal. And he decides not to do anything. He's in a position where if he wanted to, he could have the man arrested and sort of taken care of, but he chooses not to, and he sort of chooses to give the man a chance to prosper as a scientist in another country. And so we learn a lot about Ted's sense of honor and his sort of opposition to the other characters who exist in this sort of glib, dismissive sort of modern approach to life. Everything is very ironical. Everything is sort of easy to be dismissed. And the ending, we sort of reveal the additional secrets that Ted has. And those ones are best left to the reader to discover. They're really, really shocking. I was really, really surprised. It got an audible gasp out of me. I was really impressed by Hazzard's writing too. She definitely is in her like best style when she's dealing with these very like intellectual people and their conversations. But she has this interesting habit of undermining the English language, like the grammar of it. She really like interrupts her sentences in such a way where it's easy to see that something has been left unsaid. But what that is exactly, you can sort of glean the fact that the grammar stops so abruptly and there's clearly something missing. It really it brings you back to attention, the text you're reading. And I think that idea of the things that are not said, the things unsaid between the characters, it plays out in the text as well. And I was really impressed. I really liked this one. And I'd like to read, is it The Great Fire of London? There's another book that Hazzard spent like 20 years writing following this one, which I think is also supposed to be very good. So I was really impressed with The Transit of Venus by Shirley Hazzard. I read No One Knows, Stories by Osamu Dazai, and this is a collection that expands upon a pre-existing collection of stories. Dazai had published a collection called Josei in 1942. These stories that are all about women. They're female protagonists, and Dazai calls them soliloquies for women. A lot of them have female first-person narrators. And this collection, it sort of completes that series for Dazai. The stories that had been left out of the first collection and the stories that followed the same pattern following that collection, they're all collected together here. And it's a really wonderful collection from New Directions, translated by Ralph McCarthy, who does a really great job translating from the Japanese. I think if you find anything translated by him, I can recommend his translation. I think he does a really great job. I was really excited when this came out because of specifically one story in here, which was the second one here, Schoolgirl. I had heard about this story somewhere and I really wanted to read it for a long time, and there was like a smaller publisher had put out an edition like independently, like a small novella style version of Schoolgirl. But when I saw this one, I thought it was a no-brainer to get this one. And Schoolgirl was great. It's kind of like Dazai's version of like A Catcher in the Rye. Like this young woman, this schoolgirl, is very dissatisfied with her daily life, and she's sort of reflecting on the people she sees and the school she goes to and the people of her life, and how they're all sort of ultimately unsatisfying, and she has a lot of criticism for the people that surround her. It's a really a nice story, and I was really happy to finally get to it, but it wasn't the one I was most impressed with in here. There were a few that really stood out to me as being remarkable stories. The first one is the one that follows, Cherry Leaves and the Whistler. And in this one, we have a pair of sisters, one of whom is dying and seems to be receiving letters from a lover, which, in Japan at the time, this is a really big like social faux pas. The truth of the affair is as we learn about it, it's really moving, and I was really impressed with that story. I also really liked this one following it, Skin and Soul, where this woman is in she's really unsatisfied with her life, and her husband is no good, and that's another pattern that repeats itself in these stories. The husband is often a character who seems to be a representation of Dazai. He is often a writer, or he works with books, and he is incredibly unreliable. He is, as Dazai would style himself, maybe he's a tramp. So you get a sense that a lot of these male characters are sort of a way for Dazai to vent a lot of his maybe inner turmoil, maybe some self-loathing. And the women that have to deal with it, he paints them very empathetically. But this woman, she's very abrasive about how terrible her situation is, and it ends up becoming like a physical manifestation on her body. Like she breaks out in this giant rash. And the story also invokes Madame Bovary and Flaubert. And so you get to see a lot of Dazai's influences from a writing perspective as well in this story. And I'd also like to shout out this story. This one was really good. It's got this like 3-part structure. It reminded me of some of the older Russian stories. Poor situation for a young woman who is sort of doing her best to use her beauty and use her youth to create happiness in a situation that doesn't really have any, inherently. It's really got to be found by her, and she does her best to do that. I thought that was a great story too, and I thought this was a great collection. Dazai always delivers. I haven't really been disappointed with anything of his yet, and I'm really happy with New Directions for continuing to put out his stuff. I read this collection from Penguin Classics. This is Hesiod and Theognis, and it contains from Hesiod Theogony and Works and Days, and Theognis's Elegies, translated by Dorothea Wender, who brings about this question of authorship with both of these writers. That seems to be the biggest thing connecting them, besides their existence within, maybe 150 years or so of each other. Wender is pretty convinced that the Theogony and Works and Days were written by different people, and she goes into a lot of detail about why she feels that way. And she knows for a fact that the elegies are not all by Theognis, and that there are several poets who were in his school, whose poems we can identify to different writers, but they sort of just get credited to Theognis, and that's what a lot of these marks are indicating. They're indicating different writers. So Hesiod is really a classic, and someone I had known about and wanted to read for a long time. The Theogony is sort of his Greek origin myth, and this is where we get a lot of like the classical tropes of Greek mythology originally. We get like the birth of all the gods, and the rebellion against Uranus, and the Titans. We get the first description of the birth of Aphrodite, which has since become incredibly famous. But all these stories were really interesting to read, and the writing is quite good. But Works and Days is where Hesiod's like writing sort of elevates, and he gets more into mythology here, but he also talks about farming practices, and like the time you should plow your fields, and when you should plant certain crops, and the way you should treat your animals and stuff, in addition to other bits of mythology that have sort of filtered in to sort of provide context for that advice. And the writing here is definitely elevated, and you can sort of see the translator's theory play out when you read them back to back. There's definitely a difference in style that you can appreciate, but both of them are quite worth reading and quite worth your time. Theognis's poems are interesting because he's kind of a jerk. He's railing against society, and he's lamenting the loss of his youth, and the various young men who have scorned him and have come and gone from his bed chambers. And he really dislikes the poor, and he doesn't think there should be poor people. He wants to sort of maintain this aristocratic status quo. Although there are some poems in here that also have advice, like advice for male friendships and advice for leadership. The part that was really interesting to me, which Winter mentions in her introduction, is that there's a sense when you're reading Theognis that he is concerned about his own legacy, and specifically about the legacy of him as a writer, like this text, the things he had written down, existing past his life. That's very interesting to think about, and this was worth consideration again, following one of the other books I read this year or this month, which was Mimesis by Erich Auerbach, which I'll talk about in a bit. I read Memories, Dreams, Reflections by Carl Jung. This is his memoir. He tells the story of his childhood growing up. He gets into some of his his origins in the field of psychology. He spends a lot of time talking about specific cases that were interesting to him. So you get a lot of these wonderful little anecdotes from his career. And then he gets more into his more esoteric research, his travels in Africa and in the American Southwest. You get these nice letters at the end. And of course, you get a chapter devoted to his relationship with Freud. Jung's a very engaging storyteller, and whatever editing was done on this was seamless. It really feels like it's just a man telling the story of his life. The childhood section reads like a novel. That part could be read on its own by anybody. It gets a little bit more dense into psychological stuff as he goes through his career, and he gets into some of the concerns of the collective unconscious and other things that preoccupied a lot of his later years, his later professional life. But the biggest part here, the biggest like wow, amazing thing that goes on in this book is his recollection of dreams. And these dreams are far out. He remembers a dream from when he was a kid, and he ends up seeing this like statue of a phallus. Dreams of like giant mansions where each floor represents like a different century of history, and he's digging down. And it's really cool stuff, and it's a wonderful resource for anyone interested in Jung. I had heard that maybe this is a good place to start for Jung, and I'm not so sure if it's true. Like the stuff he gets into, like the nitty gritty of his theories, is pretty dense here. But he does say that he has no interest in making this memoir like a summary of his career. He doesn't want to have anything that is just sort of a sort of shallow representation of his thought. His the biography portion, I would recommend to anybody. I guess that would be the first like 4 or 5 chapters here. The more interested you are in his ideas, the more the second half of the book really becomes a wonderful resource. And the writing throughout is excellent. I really enjoyed reading this one. I read The Nonexistent Knight and The Cloven Viscount by Italo Calvino. These two complete the trilogy that he calls Our Ancestors, the other volume being The Baron in the Trees. It definitely continues this this sort of retelling of classical stories from a sort of modern approach, you know, and Calvino's particular style, like the way he likes to play with tropes and play with the structure of a story. It's really clear. These stories are both really fun to read. The Nonexistent Knight is about a knight who has no corporeal body. He's just an empty suit of armor. This is Agilolf, etc., etc. Agilolf, the knight, and he serves under Charlemagne, and he's fighting with Charlemagne in search of honor, and he's this sort of exemplary example of a knight. His sort of lack of physical being seems to prevent any of the the complications of humanity that might interfere with being the ideal knight. His claim to knighthood comes into question. He's said to have saved a maiden whose maidenhood has become, a matter of question, whether or not she was actually a maiden. And, the technicality of this means that if she wasn't a maiden upon being saved, then this act does not deserve a bestowing of knighthood, and so the non-existent knight somehow exists even less at that time. The story is written by like a nun in a tower, and we get a couple of interjections of her like as she's writing and recalling this story. Some really nice passages sort of invoking like the idea of chivalric stories and romances and stuff. And you do get a really funny love scene between the non-existent knight and a woman who engage in non-physical intercourse in a really interesting moment in this book. The second story, The Cloven Viscount, is about a young man who goes to war, and only half of his body comes home. He's cloven in half, and half of him returns fully alive, and the half that returns is utterly evil. It only enacts things of pettiness and evilness and meanness, and it seems that only the bad half of this man has returned from the war. He wants to like kill a bunch of like peasants and dissidents in the town, and so he hires the local architect to build this like crazy guillotine like thing. Like it looks like this massive tree where they're gonna hang all these people. And he just does, he like invades the leper colony, and he spreads leprosy and stuff. Just a bad all around. And then of course, eventually the second half of this man comes back, and this is the equally good half of the soldier. And so the good half and the bad half are acting separately, and the people around them are increasingly frustrated with both halves of the night. And so this also comes to its own conclusion in a very funny way. And so I had finished this book, and I thought it was okay, and it was fun, and Calvino is always entertaining to read. But I have since totally revisited my understanding of this book following reading Mimesis by Erich Auerbach, which was the last book I read this month, and I'll get to shortly. It seems that in making a story called Our Ancestors, Calvino's not just interested in revisiting the themes of the past and telling stories that take place in his local history. He is interested in recreating the reality of those times and the rules of the reality as we can understand them via texts that exist from the past and chivalric romances that exist. The rules of reality are different for them, and Calvino is writing as if these rules still existed, but with his modern sensibility and humor. The style of the prose and the way that it recreates a time in the past, which is also true for The Baron in the Trees, which I think it takes place more in like the Enlightenment time. The ability of Calvino to do that, I didn't really fully appreciate until after I had read Mimesis. So these two are great. Reading them alongside The Baron in the Trees is a good idea. It's a really fun short read. I read Plowing in the Dark by Richard Powers. This is my fourth Powers book, and he's become one of these writers that I return to every year. I seem to want to pick up one of his books, and I've read 4 at this point, and he has never failed to deliver. I have been very impressed by all of his books that I've read, but I was a little bit worried about this one from the start. Powers writes in this style where all of the characters and the dialogue, it is not realistic. People speak in very like witty sort of quips. They all have the same frame of reference, and they're able to convey things through reference in sort of this like mutual like group thought understanding. People are a little bit bitter and acerbic with each other. If that doesn't like work for you, then a lot of these characters are going to come off as like incredibly snobbish and unlikable. And that was the feeling I got from the beginning of this book. That combined with the style of using italics for dialogue, I was just like, it's just a little bit too cute. It's a little too precious. It's a little too much. By the end of the book, it all worked for me by the end, I was really impressed. This book has a lot of the themes that Powers likes to write about in his books, sort of the meeting place between art and science, sort of the cutting edge of science and representations of art history and art theory, and sort of where they overlap, and how the main character here is an artist, a former artist, since like graphic designer for like marketing, who is recruited to help with a virtual reality computer. And this book came out in the year 2000, so that's important for a couple of reasons. The technology of the time, this idea of a virtual reality room being this thing that you could interact with, obviously totally different than how we think about it now. They're trying to create this virtual reality experience, and they need to create like they need someone to fill it with images. And so they hire this artist who ends up digital painting like this room into like the various paintings she loves. And these ones are from the cover too. So you get Van Gogh and you get Rousseau. And these 2 paintings are sort of the prime motifs of art. They sort of repeat a lot through here. And this idea of a room also plays out repeatedly. This virtual room, this room of Van Gogh's. And then you get the second part of this story, which is about a man who travels to, oh God, I think it's Lebanon. He's in the Middle East and he's teaching over there, and he ends up being kidnapped by local terrorists, and he is left in solitary confinement for a long period of time. So he's stuck in a room, and we're experiencing the physical results, the mental deterioration of a person stuck in a room, alongside this sort of creation of the ultimate room, and representations of beautiful rooms that we know from art. And this is sort of the driving force. This is the thing that really connects the two halves of the story. I really like Powers. I really like all of these books of his that I've read, and he's becoming one of my favorite writers, but I haven't read anything of his yet, and I don't know if he has a book that will really like elevate him into that ultimate highest class of writers. I really like how all of his books they're very set in their particular time. The technology he likes to write about, it sort of shows this like ever unfolding like process of innovation, and how it sort of behooves artists and writers and people creating technology to sort of maintain the human element of things. And I think ultimately that's what I like the most about Powers, is he really values the humanity of his characters and the humanity of his world. We'll see. I mean, he's got 10 more books to read, and perhaps by the time I've read all of them, he will be firmly one of my favorite writers. I really like this book, Plowing the Dark. Following that, I read The Enlightenment of Katzuo Nakamatsu by Augusto Higa Oshiro, who is a second generation Japanese immigrant from Peru, who was born in the 40s and I think passed away a couple of years ago. Oshiro is part of the second generation of Japanese immigrants in Peru, and this is what he writes about, the immigrant experience living in Peru as a Japanese person. At some point in the 90s, he returned to Japan and was working in a factory for a couple of years. This got him more interested in writing about the sort of working class style, like the working class people of Japan and the Japanese people from his community in Peru. This is a really short novel, little novella really, about Katsuo Nakamatsu, who has decided, he's come to the conclusion that he is going to commit suicide. And as soon as he reaches this conclusion, it seems that his past and the past of his community are conspiring against him to complete this act. He ends up visiting a lot of his friends and reminiscing about their childhoods as Japanese immigrants in Peru. But he also spends a lot of time thinking about his father and his father's generation, who were there during the Second World War and fighting for Japan. They were proudly representing the Japanese Empire during the Second World War. As he decides to end his life, they bubble up in his consciousness, and eventually it seems that he's almost possessed by this past, this first generation of Japanese immigrants in Peru. They possess him, and there's this really great scene with like a seance. I thought this was a really nice, short and sweet book from Augusto Higa Oshiro, and I think maybe this is his only book available in English, but hopefully that will change in the near future. Lastly, I read Mimesis, The Representation of Reality in Western Literature by Erich Auerbach, and off the bat, might be the best book I read this year. This book is phenomenal. God, I don't even know where to start. Auerbach was he was a German, I think he was German, maybe from Switzerland, German language writer, scholar, who wrote this book in Istanbul during the Second World War. And because of his isolation, he had no access to any of his texts. He had no library to visit. All of this was sort of created from his memory and the books that he had available. And he mentions at one point in, I think, the epilogue, that this is why the book doesn't have any notes. This is just what he was able to put together through his own personal resources. And so, besides the extended passages that he quotes throughout the book, there are no notes to be had. Auerbach is interested in showing how over time literature has changed in its representation of real life and real people. He chooses as his place to start, of course, the two sort of ultimate sources of Western literature, Homer and the Bible. And this first essay, Odysseus's Scar, I think this has been anthologized a bunch. This is like one of the most famous literary criticism essays ever. To make this point about the difference between Homer and the Bible, he talks about this scene. Odysseus has come home and his housekeeper Eurycleia sees a scar on his leg, and this is how she recognizes him. And how in this passage, the Homer sort of describes her recognizing the scar and then changes to the events in which the scar was given to Odysseus, and then back to the present. The way in which it's written is entirely, as Auerbach says, in foreground. There's a sort of constant stream of phenomena occurring that you can witness, and everything takes place clearly and directly. He also talks about how all of the intervening gods that come into the Odyssey and the Iliad, we know exactly where they were before they intervened and what they were doing. They were here, and then they came down, and then they did this. It is all given to you directly. Whereas in the Bible, everything is sort of background. Lo and behold, let there be light. How and why that happens, it's not written down. And so this forces the readers to engage in more thinking about purposes and motivations and feelings. The other big thing he talks about repeatedly, he talks about how in Homer and in antiquity, there is this clear separation between the high and the low, low culture and high culture, low culture being reserved for comedy, and high culture being the field for epic poems and things like the Iliad and the Odyssey. This is ultimately impossible in any sort of Christian literature, because we have fundamental to the Christian literature the high and the low, the highest of the highs and the lowest of the lows being mixed in the form of Jesus. Jesus, the poor carpenter's son, who is also the Son of God. This mix of high and low creates it, it makes it impossible to have them separate. And the last thing he talks about with the Bible is this idea of figural interpretation. Regardless of chronological publication or order, you're sort of able to create evidence for a divine plan by retroactively creating interpretations. And this is why a lot of images and motifs from the New Testament are so clearly reflected by the Old Testament. It was sort of created to form this connection, and that everything that occurred was all part of this ultimate divine plan. So these are his big ideas at the start, and this is where he starts us off. And from there, it's just a complete chronological history of Western literature, and showing how these ideas develop over time, how we get further and further into Christianity, how the Christian ideal of a Christian literature grows. And then we get to his second great essay, which is this one, Farinata and Cavalcante, about Dante's Inferno, Dante's comedy. Auerbach places Dante at the the pivot point, the ultimate end of Christian literature and the creation of modern literature. Dante is sort of the end-all, be-all of literature as such. Auerbach uses the example of these two characters, Farinata and Cavalcante, who Dante and Virgil encounter in the sixth circle of hell, and who are connected to Dante's life in Florence. They knew his ancestors, or in some cases, I think their family knew Dante directly. He goes through like word by word, line by line, how these characters appear and what they say, the syntax of the writing, and the what they represent. These two characters exist in hell in a completely representative way that they existed on Earth. And this relationship for Auerbach is incredibly important. And he just goes through it so minutely, and everything, he makes it so clear what he's trying to get at. His writing is so sharp. And by virtue of this immediate and admiring sympathy with man, the principle, rooted in the divine order of the indestructibility of the whole historical and individual man, turns against that order, makes it subservient to its own purposes, and obscures it. The image of man eclipses the image of God. Dante's work made man's Christian figural being a reality and destroyed it in the very process of realizing it. And so following Dante, we get more a continued history of literature, shifting into more like the development of motifs that we see appearing in Boccaccio and Rabelais and Shakespeare. The essay on Rabelais is great. He gives a really good defense of Rabelais and how he's not just, all the fart and pee jokes. He's like, there's like legitimate literary merit to what he's doing. He continues on, and then there's like a final break during the French Revolution, and how this also created a huge shift in the ways that writers were representing their reality, and how they become way more interested in creating a realism. And so there are two chapters at the end which go through French literature from Stendhal to Balzac to Zola. And the final chapter of this book, he talks about modernism in the 20s, specifically Virginia Woolf and Marcel Proust, and he mentions other modern writers, Joyce and Thomas Mann, among others. And it's just from beginning to end, the development of literature. It's so valuable. It's such a valuable piece of work. Anyone who's serious about understanding like literature as like a historical event, and like interested in learning why literature is the way it is now, and why we value certain things in our books from an objective point of view, this book is you can't miss it. As I was reading, it started just making sense for me, and unlocking so many windows and so many doors, things that suddenly became crystal clear as soon as I had read these pages. And I started drawing these little keys in the margins, because I just everything I wanted to make sure I could remember. Like at this moment, I suddenly felt like such clarity. Like, oh man, like of course, it makes so much make sense in literature, and it's particularly valuable to me. I grew up Jewish, and so a lot of I always feel like I'm missing a lot of things when I read some older literature in particular. A lot of the allusions to the Bible and things that pertain to a Christian worldview, I feel like a lot of it goes over my head. And this book just made it so clear, like this is what those old writers were doing, and why, and how it relates to a Christian-based history of literature. Auerbach isn't like interested in religious theology. He's just the truth of the matter is that Western literature developed from a Christian tradition, and so it's really important to understand where that came from, how it developed, and how ultimately it was destroyed. And Auerbach says that happened in Dante. It deserves rereading endlessly. It deserves so much more time devoted to it. I should reread this book. Some of the essays I would like to reread as often as I can. but it is quite dense. And the one knock against this book is that Auerbach uses a lot of quotes, and he is a linguist by trade. He was a professor of Romance languages, and so he uses a lot of like syntactical language. He really gets into the nitty gritty of sentence structure, and he also quotes things extensively. There are the beginning of the essays usually have an extended passage that he then quotes and translates. But a lot of like smaller quotes and a lot of like sentence fragments and pieces that he uses to give his examples, he doesn't bother translating. There's a lot of stuff in here that, you know, you can see right here. Like, there's just so much foreign language in the text that, you know, you just sort of gloss over it after a while, unfortunately. As much as I wish I understood medieval French, like, and even that, like, it's never unclear what he's talking about, and he always provides context for what he's quoting and why, but you sort of miss the true meaning of the words. It was a great reading experience, and I'm very, very thankful to have finally gotten to it. It really feels like you know, a whole like new way of interpreting literature has opened up to me. That feels great. So that was Mimesis, and that was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 books in September. Thank you so much for watching.